At the last alumni fundraiser, they skipped my name during roll call. The woman on stage paused, looked at the list, then simply moved on, as if I had never sat in those same classrooms, walked those same halls, or worn the same stitched crest on my chest. That's how I found out I wasn't invited. Not from a call, not from a message, not even a mistake in the mail. I saw it taped to the inside of a cafe window, a glossy flyer in gold and navy. The Legacy Gala, honoring the past, funding the future. My graduation year was printed right there, bold and proud. So were the names of former classmates, some with titles, some with headshots. But my name wasn't anywhere. I called, politely at first. A young voice on the line said the list was curated carefully and that the event had limited seating. Then she added, casually like commenting on the weather, "We're trying to maintain a certain image, sir. A certain image." That was it. That was the phrase that sliced something open I hadn't realized still bled. I hung up without another word and sat back in my chair. The same chair I'd used to review the final blueprints of a building I'd funded 2 years ago. A library wing for that very school, but I hadn't put my name on the plaque. Didn't need to. Never wanted to. Back then I thought legacy meant building quietly, letting others take the spotlight, so long as the light itself stayed on. Turns out the moment you take your name off the banner, they forget who raised the tent. I looked around my office, framed sketches, structural mock-ups, engineering awards, notes in my daughter's handwriting, and felt something unfamiliar rise in my chest. Not anger, not bitterness, just the hollow click of a door that's quietly locked itself from the inside. Everyone had been invited. Every lawyer, every hedge fund heir, every politician who once copied from my notes in math class, every polished face now grinning on social media with hashtags like Achke Legacy Gala 2025. Everyone except the boy who once stayed late to fix the broken projector, the one who won the scholarship no one thought he'd keep, the one who showed up to prom in a suit he patched himself. They didn't forget me. They erased me. And it's strange how silence can feel louder than a room full of applause not meant for you. My daughter asked me that evening, "Are we going to the big event?" I smiled. "No, sweetheart. I think they're saving those seats for the right kind of alumni." She blinked. "You mean the rich ones?" I laughed then, not because it was funny, but because she said it without malice. Just truth. And she didn't know that I could have bought every table in that ballroom twice over. But that's not what this was about. This wasn't about money. It was about memory. And they had decided that mine didn't count. So I folded the flyer, placed it in my drawer, and I waited, not for their invitation, but for my moment. Friends, let me take a short pause. If you're listening to this right now, would you mind sharing in the comments? Where are you watching from? Have you ever experienced something similar? A moment when you were quietly left out by people who once called you one of their own? If this story touches something in you, please consider liking this video, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us grow this channel and continue telling stories that matter. Now, let's continue. The next morning, I walked into the same cafe I'd visited every week for the last 20 years. Same stool by the window, same black coffee, same habit of sitting alone, not out of loneliness, but peace. I liked watching the world move, people rushing, talking, pretending, while I stayed still, present, whole. That day, the table behind me wasn't quiet. I knew the voices before I turned. Men I'd once stood beside in woodshop class, now wearing watches that cost more than my first car. They didn't see me as they laughed over oat milk and headlines. They didn't notice the man who sat one table away, the one they used to ask for help when their father's truck wouldn't start, or when their back porch collapsed during winter. "He'll probably show up in that same old jacket," one of them said. "Still smells like engine oil, I bet," another chuckled. They were talking about me, and they weren't even whispering. I froze mid-sip, the cup trembling slightly in my hand. They didn't know I was there, or maybe they did, and simply didn't care. Either way, they laughed, full, loud, confident, and I sat with the sound. The jacket they mocked, it had a torn cuff, sure, but it was the same one I wore the day I carried my daughter into the emergency room when she broke her arm. The one I wore when I picked up a stranger's kid from the side of the highway after a snowstorm. The one my wife used to tug gently by the sleeve when we walked too far and forgot the time. They called it old. I called it earned. The engine oil? Maybe. It clung to my skin after years under hoods and machines. But they forgot that while they sat in air-conditioned boardrooms, someone had to keep the city moving. Someone had to fix what broke when no one else was watching. I didn't turn around. I didn't confront them. Because what's the point of demanding respect from people who built their self-worth on forgetting yours? But deep down, something shifted. It wasn't the insult that stung. It was the memory. The realization that these were the same boys whose cars I had fixed before senior prom. The same ones whose fathers used to shake my hand and say, "You've got a future, son, just not the kind that fits in a suit." They were right, I suppose. I never fit in a suit. But I fit in places they'd never dared to go, under the foundations, behind the drywall, in the real work of building a life that could hold weight. They had become faces on flyers. I had become invisible, but only to them, not to the people who mattered, not to the workers I hired with second chances, not to the families who lived in homes I helped build from the dirt up, not to the daughter who still calls me her hero. So I finished my coffee, left a tip, walked out without a word. But as the door shut behind me, I didn't just hear laughter anymore. I heard something else, the sound of a clock ticking, because I knew their night was coming, and when it did, they wouldn't be laughing. They all knew. They knew I owned a company, that I signed the paychecks of over 80 employees, that I built something from nothing, no inheritance, no degrees framed in gold leaf, just time, and grit, and long nights with raw hands and unpaid invoices. But none of that mattered to them. Not really, because I hadn't come from the right pipeline. I hadn't shaken hands with the right professors, or sat in the front row of finance lectures. I hadn't interned at legacy firms or played squash with board members on the weekends. My path had started in sawdust and blueprints, not in lecture halls and wine mixers, and for that I would always be, in their eyes, the guy from trade school. They said it like a footnote, like something you politely skip over during introductions. Never mind that my company had outlived 3 of theirs. Never mind that I'd been asked to speak at conferences they merely attended. Never mind that I had funded programs, anonymously, for the very school that now airbrushed me out of its brochures. I remember once, years ago at a networking brunch the school hosted, one of the old classmates approached me. "You're doing well for what you studied," he said with a half smile. "Didn't think you'd end up running your own firm." What he meant was, you weren't supposed to make it here. What he meant was, you didn't go through the gate, so you don't belong in the garden. I smiled, thanked him, and walked away. Because success doesn't need permission slips. And yet, no matter how far I had come, to them, I was still wearing work boots, still holding a wrench, even if I was holding an entire company. I wasn't one of the polished alumni, not in their black tie echo chamber, not in their curated emails and glossy invites, and fundraising galas lined with designer fabric and curated speaker lists. I wasn't one of them. But the funny thing is, I never wanted to be. I didn't envy the softness in their handshakes, or the way they spoke in half-sentences laced with buzzwords and approval-seeking laughter. I valued weight, substance, the kind of dignity that doesn't come with applause, but with legacy. Still, it hurt in a quiet, specific way. To be invisible not because you failed, but because you succeeded on your own terms. I watched them flaunt titles that were bought, not earned, heard them toast to visions they didn't build, and still they kept my name off the guest list, as if success only counted when it fit neatly into a frame they had designed. But I'd learned long ago, if the room doesn't welcome your name, then maybe your name belongs on the building. And something in me, patient, still, and forged in silence, started to stir. Let them have their titles. I was working on something they'd never see coming. I told myself it didn't matter, that I wasn't going to sign up, that I had better things to do with my time than sip overpriced wine and watch old classmates pretend they remembered one another's middle names. But late one night, after the house had gone quiet and the lamp on my desk threw long shadows across old files, I opened the school's alumni page. Curiosity, weakness, maybe something closer to hope. There it was. Register now for the Legacy Gala, a night of memory and vision. The form was simple: name, graduation year, guest count. I filled it out carefully, even typed slowly, as if precision could earn respect. Clicked submit. Nothing. The wheel spun once, then froze. An error message blinked up in gray text. Submission failed. Please try again later. I refreshed, tried again. Same result. I closed the page and went to bed. The next morning I checked my inbox. Nothing. Then later that afternoon, a short email from the alumni office, addressed politely but with no warmth. Dear Mr. Hart, thank you for your interest in the Legacy Gala. Unfortunately, we are currently at capacity and unable to accommodate further guests at this time. We appreciate your support of the school's mission and encourage you to join us for future events. No apology, no waiting list, just a shut door phrased like a handshake. I sat still, rereading the lines as if they might change. Capacity. The word stung in a way I didn't expect, because it wasn't just about a seat at a table. It was about worth. About being told again that no matter what I'd built, what I'd given, what I'd become, there simply wasn't room for me. But then, days later, I saw the posts. Photos flooded the alumni page. Faces I hadn't seen in years, all lined in gold-trimmed filters. Glasses raised, smiles rehearsed. Captions about legacy and leadership and giving back to what shaped us. They had added names, late registrations, special guests, even last-minute appearances from donors I knew hadn't confirmed weeks ago they weren't at capacity. They had just reached their capacity. Yeah, for people like me. I zoomed in on one photo. A round table of former classmates laughing. Behind them, the new school crest lit up on the screen. Beneath it, a phrase, honoring all who built us. And I realized in that moment what they really meant. All, except the ones who built with their hands. Except the ones who didn't wear it like a badge, but carried it like a weight. Except the ones whose names weren't printed, because their work spoke louder than any ink ever could. I closed the page, sat in silence. I wasn't angry. I wasn't surprised. But I was resolved, because if they could erase me that easily, then I'd remind them in a way they'd never forget. Not with noise, not with protest, but with presence. A quiet kind of return. The kind that doesn't ask for permission. It sponsors the whole room. She came into my office one evening, still in her school uniform, cheeks flushed from the cold and eyes bright with that familiar kind of excitement only kids have when they think their parents are invincible. She was holding the same flyer I'd hidden in my desk drawer days ago. Daddy, look, they're doing a big event at your old school. Can we go? I didn't answer right away, just looked at her, small and sure, standing in the place where her mother once stood, holding floor plans and hope. She had her mother's eyebrows, the way they arched slightly when she was proud of something, and right now she was proud of me, of who I was, of who she believed I'd always been. I want to see where you studied, she said. You said you helped to build things there, right? I nodded slowly, heart heavy. Were you going to show them what you've done, like how you run your company now? She climbed into the chair across from me, legs dangling, hands resting on the desk, like she was about to interview me for a documentary. Her eyes were full of something too pure, admiration without conditions. I wanted to say yes, wanted to tell her I'd walk her through every hallway, that we'd sit at the gala and raise a glass, that I'd introduce her to people who once doubted me, and show her that perseverance writes its own ending. But the truth was quieter. I leaned forward and said it gently, like ripping a bandage over a bruise too deep to explain. We weren't invited. She blinked, confused. But why? I paused, let the question sit in the air between us. I guess they didn't think I belonged. The words felt ugly as I said them. I didn't want her to carry that idea. That success needed approval. That what you build means nothing if the right people don't applaud. Her face fell, not in anger, not in tears, but in something worse. Disbelief, the kind that only comes when a child realizes the world isn't always fair, that sometimes the heroes in their life can be overlooked, forgotten, erased. But you give people jobs. You help them, right? She didn't understand, and neither did I. How do you explain to your child that the world doesn't always reward merit? That the ones who build with their hands are often pushed aside by those who only polish the surface? I wanted to protect her from that truth, to tell her this was just a mix-up, an oversight, but she was old enough to hear it, and more importantly, old enough to remember. So I reached across the desk and held her hand. She squeezed back, not out of comfort, but in solidarity. She was silent the rest of the evening. No more questions, just a kind of quiet watching, as if trying to understand how a room could be full of celebration and still forget the man who helped raise its walls. Later that night, after she'd gone to bed, I stood by her door for a while, just listening to the sound of her breathing. I thought of Eliza, how she used to say our daughter would grow into fire if we gave her truth instead of noise. And I realized something then. This story wasn't going to end in silence, because even if I wasn't on their list, I was already written into the next generation, and she, with her eyes wide open, would remember who was kept out and who still walked in. It came in quietly, the way most truths do, through the back door. A vendor I'd worked with for years stopped by the office for a routine check-in. We sat in the conference room, talked about steel prices, the rising cost of materials, shipment delays, business as usual, until he leaned back, glanced at the door like someone might be listening, and said, almost as an afterthought, "You hear about the gala mess?" I didn't answer, just looked at him. He smiled slightly, not out of joy, more like someone holding a truth too long and finally setting it down. They're scrambling. Lost a big sponsor last minute. Real money. They're holding emergency meetings. Quiet, though. Don't want it getting out. My hands didn't move, but something in my chest did. They'll patch it, I said calmly. He shrugged. Maybe. But they're 3 weeks out and bleeding. Word is, they're too proud to call anyone they once dismissed. I knew what he meant. They wouldn't call me, not because they didn't need me, but because needing me meant admitting they were wrong. It meant acknowledging the man they hadn't just forgotten, but excluded, now had what they were missing. I nodded, thanked him, walked him out, and then sat alone in that conference room, staring out the window as dusk poured across the parking lot like slow smoke. They were sinking, and I could help. I had the means, the network, the resources to keep the lights on, the tables dressed, the speeches written. I could have filled the gap without blinking. I could have saved them, again, without needing the spotlight. But they wouldn't ask. Because pride, I've learned, is louder than desperation. It convinces people to suffer quietly rather than admit they were wrong about someone who once worked with their hands. And in that silence, in that locked door panic they thought I'd never hear about, I saw them more clearly than ever. They didn't just want wealth. They wanted polished wealth, the kind that wore blazers without lint and used the word legacy like a brand. To them I was a different kind of money, the kind that didn't come with shine. And so they'd rather drown quietly than let the world see me toss them a rope. I should have felt satisfaction, but I didn't. Because watching people struggle, even people who once erased you, isn't something I ever learned to enjoy. That's not how I was raised. That's not what Eliza would have wanted. So I sat there, in the room I built with calloused hands and clean intentions, and I thought about my daughter, about the disappointment in her eyes, about what she was learning from all of this. And then I made a decision, not to call them, not to offer, but to act, because some storms don't need announcements, some kindness doesn't need to be named, and some truths are louder when revealed at the right time. I placed the call late that evening when the office lights were dim and the hum of machines had faded into an uneasy quiet. I used the holding company's number, its name unfamiliar to all but my closest board members, and spoke in brief, businesslike terms. No name on the line, no personal history, just an offer. Full sponsorship to fill their budget gap. Cover every table, hire every musician, print every brochure. No PR, no fuss. Only one simple condition. Their final announcement must name the sponsor who made it possible. I hung up without hesitation. No trace of ego in my voice, only purpose. There was a power in anonymity I'd never felt before. The freedom to act without expectation, to give without the weight of gratitude demanded. I watched in silence as the days slipped by, as their emergency meetings stretched into late nights and hushed phone conferences. They still didn't know who had stepped in. They thought maybe one of the polished donors who drifted in from the city's boardrooms, offering money in exchange for influence. They wondered if a foundation had quietly written a check. They speculated nervously. Meanwhile, I walked past blueprints in my own office, dressed in the same worn jacket they mocked, boots scuffed from another project site. My daughter beside me drew sketches of her own on sticky notes, little towers reaching for the sky. She didn't ask who the sponsor was. She just smiled whenever we passed the cafe's television screen and saw the gala's progress. Because to her, it was our victory too. On the morning the press release arrived, I saw the headline before I read the body. Gala saved in final hour by unexpected gift. The article praised the organizers for their resilience and the community for its support. The donor would be revealed at the conclusion of the evening's program, they wrote, a surprise element to honor the spirit of generosity. I felt a quiet thrill, not for recognition, but for the irony. The same room that once erased me would now speak my name. The same faces that whispered my insignificance would soon hear of my significance. But they still wouldn't connect me to the name on the flyer. They would see only the words, not the hands behind them. And when the night came and the lights dimmed once more for speeches and thanks, they would unmask the sponsor in front of a crowd unprepared, an institution that had once decided I wouldn't fit the image, now forced to fit my name into every program, every broadcast, every memory. It was a moment neither I nor my daughter would forget, a demonstration of quiet power, the kind built not on noise or titles, but on integrity and action. Because sometimes the greatest proof of worth comes when you choose to step forward, in shadow, then let the world light up at your unveiling. I arrived early, not as a guest, not even as a name on a list, just a shadow in the corner of the great hall they'd rented. I wore the same suit I'd worn to Eliza's memorial, not because I lacked another, but because it reminded me who I was, and who I wasn't pretending to be. They were rehearsing. The lights were still being tested, casting gold across velvet drapes and borrowed elegance. Floral arrangements stood like statues around the room, carefully placed for symmetry, not for scent. Everything was curated, styled, made to look effortless. I watched as planners moved in tight circles, walkie-talkies in hand, adjusting chairs by inches and frowning at napkins that weren't folded to spec. But it was the voices that stung most. I stood near the farthest pillar, behind the tall centerpieces, where no one looked unless they needed a power outlet. From there, I saw them, the hosts, the speakers, the polished graduates with perfect hair and tailored sleeves, practicing the rhythm of false gratitude. One man, with a name I remembered from my yearbook, kept fumbling his lines. "We are deeply honored to be joined tonight by our visionary sponsors." He stopped, laughing. God, who are they again? Do we even know? Someone else chimed in. Who cares? Just say corporate generosity and move on. Everyone's here for the photo op anyway. They laughed. Real laughter. The kind that tastes like wine and old entitlement. They didn't know. They didn't care to. Not once did anyone stop and ask, who helped us? Who saved the event? It didn't cross their minds that a hand behind the curtain might be the one that had carried the whole thing. They talked about legacy, about excellence, about how some people just have a natural sense of vision, but no one spoke of sacrifice, of labor, of humility. Their words were smooth, their shoes were shiny, but there was no weight behind any of it. I watched as they rehearsed their clinking glasses, their raised eyebrows, their humble nods. I saw them pause at the teleprompter, practicing which lines to pause for applause, which jokes would get the right balance of self-deprecation and charm. It was performance, all of it, not memory, not truth, not legacy. And still, I stayed. I stood there with my hands in my pockets, listening to their vanity echo off the walls I had paid to light. I didn't hate them. That would have been too easy. Hate simplifies people into things. No, I saw them. I saw the boys who once borrowed notes off my desk, now pretending they had built something. The same hands that once passed me in silence now shaping the evening around their own reflection. And none of them noticed me, not even for a second. And I realized something deeper than anger. I realized I had already let them go. They weren't my peers, not anymore. They were still performing, still hoping applause could replace authenticity. But I had stopped performing long ago. I had already lived the story they were trying to script. And the ending, the real ending, was still coming, quietly, like a storm with no sound, until the lightning speaks your name. When the night finally came, I entered through the side entrance. No valet, no flash. I walked past the crowds gathering out front, the laughter swelling beneath strings of white lights and well-practiced hellos. A few glanced my way, quickly, dismissively, like I was part of the setup crew running late. I didn't mind. I carried nothing they could recognize as significance. At the reception desk, a girl with a clipboard scanned the list, lips tight, brows furrowed. I gave her my name. She paused, then smiled. That tight, uncomfortable kind of smile people give when the math doesn't add up. Oh, wait, yes, you're, seated in the back section near the exit, right this way. She gestured quickly, already turning to the next name. The ballroom was enormous. Crystal chandeliers, gold trim, tables layered with fabric too fine to touch. Everyone looked dipped in light. Sequins, silk, suits so sharp they looked sculpted. And then there was my chair, folded, thin, set at a corner table that hugged the edge of the room near the emergency exit sign. It wobbled when I sat. No place card, no introduction, just a silent message. We saw your name. We didn't know what to do with it, but it didn't matter. I didn't come to be seen. I came to see. From my quiet little corner, I had the perfect view. I watched as old classmates hugged for the camera, then turned away before the flash even faded. I watched as men adjusted their ties before every photo, as if they could straighten their character with fabric. I watched as women tossed glances across tables like currency, investing only in the faces they'd seen in magazines or local articles. And I remembered the boy who once borrowed $20 from me because he forgot his wallet, now raising a toast about earning everything the hard way. I remembered the girl who sat next to me in economics, too distracted to study, now gushing about discipline and vision, while her assistant held her phone. I remembered the principal, now retired and frail, sitting alone at a table with no microphone. The same man who once said, "Some students aren't made for success, and that's okay." He was talking about me. They passed him by too. No one knelt beside his chair to say thank you. They didn't see him anymore, just like they didn't see me. That's what this room was, mirrors and ghosts. Each person polishing a version of themselves they hoped would reflect well under the chandelier light, and beneath it all the same truth pulsed like a vein under fine linen. This event wasn't built on legacy. It was built on forgetting. But I remembered. I remembered who they used to be, who I used to be, the late nights fixing cars in the school lot, the calls I took when their parents couldn't afford a plumber, the hours Eliza and I spent building donation plans so other kids could have books we once lacked. And none of that was on the brochure tonight. I looked down at my hands, same hands, worn, weathered, still steady. I wasn't out of place. I was exactly where I needed to be, because they hadn't given me that seat to honor me. They gave it to me to hide me, but in doing so, they gave me the clearest view of all. The view from behind the curtain. The view of a room built on illusions, waiting for one moment of truth. They walked past me like I was part of the furniture. A coat rack, a waiter on break, a misplaced fixture in a room designed to shine without weight. I sat still, hands folded gently in my lap, eyes tracing the paths of old friends who now moved like strangers. Some glanced in my direction, brief flickers of almost recognition. That pause in the eyes like the soul whispered, "You know him," but the mind swatted it away, too busy, too distracted by glitter and the sound of their own name being said too loudly across the room. They didn't stop. Not one. I watched as Mark Ellison strutted by, champagne in hand, laughing about IPOs. Mark, who once sobbed behind the gym when his father didn't show up to his graduation. I sat with him that night, bought him a soda from the machine with the last dollar in my wallet. He never looked at me as he passed. His cufflinks gleamed where his gratitude used to live. Then came Donna, still graceful, still perfectly dressed in that effortless, exhausting way. We'd spent 2 semesters working on a community project together, back when she used to call me her rock in group assignments. She glanced at me with that social smile, the one you use for staff who hold doors, and kept walking. Eric nodded from across the room, too far to see the tension in his smile. We'd built our senior project with bare hands and borrowed tools, stayed late on school nights, watched each other's families break and rebuild. But tonight, his hand rested on the shoulder of someone else, someone shinier, someone invited. And I realized it wasn't that they didn't see me. It was that they chose not to. Because to see me now meant reckoning with the versions of themselves they'd edited out. It meant remembering the boy who stayed after class to help them, who drove them home when their cars broke down, who sat in the cheap seats at their weddings and left before the speeches. It meant confronting the uncomfortable truth that the man they had erased from their new lives was the very one who made parts of those lives possible. Their hands were full now. Champagne, business cards, curated ambition, too full for memory, too full for humility. But I saw them, every crack under the polish, every insecurity hiding behind loud stories, every desperate smile reaching for validation they still hadn't earned. And the ache inside me wasn't bitterness. It was mourning, not for what I'd lost, but for what they had. Because they had traded sincerity for status, depth for applause, history for optics, and I had kept something they no longer recognized: integrity, stillness, and the long, quiet power of a man who remembers where he came from and who he helped on the way up. As the music swelled and another round of toasts began, I stayed in my corner seat, untouched and unseen, not because I was forgotten, but because I no longer fit the costume they wore so tightly. And when the time came, when the curtain fell and the truth walked through the room, they wouldn't know where to look. She arrived just after the first round of speeches. I had told her she didn't need to come, that the night wasn't built for people like us, but she insisted, said, "If you're going to sit through a show, at least let someone sit with you." She said it like a joke, but her eyes were serious, her mother's eyes. She walked into that room in a simple navy dress, no jewelry but a thin silver chain Eliza once wore on her wedding day. No makeup beyond what she needed. She didn't shine, she stood. Quiet, clear, rooted, heads turned, but not in the way they turned for money. No, she wasn't glitter or glamour. She was presence. She moved toward me with that same confidence I'd seen in her since she was a child. The kind that didn't ask for space, but made it without force. She sat beside me, folded her hands like I did, and looked around. They didn't know who she was, just another guest in the shadows. And yet somehow she brought light to the very edge of that room. After a few minutes, she leaned over. "Why are they ignoring you?" Her voice wasn't angry. It was steady, curious, but not naive. I looked at her, and for a long moment, I didn't know what to say. How do you explain a lifetime of being underestimated without sounding bitter? How do you wrap decades of service, of sacrifice, of silent building into one sentence a daughter can carry without being weighed down? So I told her the truth, not the hard truth, just the clear one. Because they think I need their attention. She blinked, tilted her head. "But you don't." "No," I said, "I never did." She sat back in her chair, but her gaze didn't leave them. The ones who once called me friend, partner, brother, the ones now laughing with glasses raised and backs turned, unaware that the floor beneath their feet had been paid for by the man in the back. And then she did something I didn't expect. She reached for my hand, held it, like her mother used to when I was too quiet after long days. Her grip wasn't comforting, it was anchoring, like she was saying, "I see you, I see all of it." And in that moment, I felt something shift. Not in them, but in me. Because all my life, I'd looked for recognition in rooms that demanded I beg for it. But here beside me sat the only legacy I ever truly needed, with her mother's fire in her spine and her own voice in her chest. and she didn't need a plaque or a toast to know who I was. She already did. As the next speaker stepped onto the stage, thanking the visionary minds who made this night possible, I watched her eyes narrow slightly. She leaned in again and whispered, "They still don't know, do they?" "No," I said, "not yet." She smiled then, not with amusement, with knowing, because she understood what was coming, the kind of truth that doesn't knock, it rings out. And when it did, we would still be in the same place. In the back, steady, untouched, but no longer unseen. The room had grown louder with each course. Laughter spilled between tables like spilled wine, smooth and careless. Plates clinked, hands gestured, and every corner buzzed with stories designed for listening ears, not truth. The air was thick with polished pride, the kind that dripped off suits and sequins like perfume, invisible but unmistakable. I sat still through it all, beside my daughter, who hadn't let go of my hand since the second course. I could see it on her face, the growing tension, the quiet disbelief, as one by one, names were lifted, toasted, celebrated. Some I recognized, most I didn't. Donors, old prefects, founders of promising ventures, men and women who hadn't built anything with their hands, only shaped their reputations with the help of borrowed ladders. Then came the clinking of glasses, the polite hush, the practiced pause in the music that signaled the moment everyone had been waiting for, the final speech. The host returned to the stage, beaming, paper in hand, his voice still crisp despite the wine. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "what a night it's been. We've honored old friends, welcomed new ones, and most importantly, we've strengthened the ties that make this community what it is, enduring, generous, and proud." He looked out across the room as if trying to see every face, though his eyes never landed on the table in the back. We've had the joy of hearing from speakers, leaders, and visionaries, and none of it, absolutely none of it, would have been possible without one man. He paused. A ripple moved through the room, curiosity, assumptions. Someone who stepped in when things were uncertain, who didn't ask for recognition, who didn't need a stage. I felt my daughter's grip tighten. My breath stayed shallow, not out of nerves, but out of the deep, still ache of memory. Eliza would have wept. The host glanced down at his paper, then back up. "And now, a tribute to our main sponsor, the man who made tonight possible." There was a silence then, full and round. I watched as some leaned forward. Others turned their heads, expecting a familiar name, expecting one of them. But they didn't know what was coming. Not yet. The host's voice grew softer, slower. A man whose story didn't start in boardrooms or headlines, but in hard work, in humility, in building quietly, faithfully, what so many of us now stand upon. Please join me in honoring Mr. Robert Hart. Silence. Then motion. Heads turned, mouths parted, glasses lowered mid-sip. It was as if the chandelier light had shifted, refracting onto something none of them had seen before, or had chosen not to. Robert Hart. The name fell through the room like a crack in marble, too clean, too sharp to be mistaken, and I saw them. Mark. Dana. Eric. The planners. The ones who hadn't looked at me twice all night. I saw the disbelief wash over them like cold water. Recognition blooming too late. Pride shriveling too slow. Some mouths opened as if to say something. Apologize, maybe. Justify. But it was too late for words. The lights hadn't changed. The decor remained the same. But the room had shifted, because now they knew. The man in the back, the one with the folded chair, no name card, no fanfare, had built the very night they were standing on. And all they had done was ignore him. I didn't stand. I didn't wave. I simply looked at my daughter, who was already looking at me. And in her eyes I saw everything I ever needed to hear. The name hung in the air, heavy as a final bell. At first it was a murmur, just one syllable rolling off polished lips, and their laughter and chatter faltered. Glasses paused mid-raise, forks hovered in mid-air, and heads turned, as though a single word had cracked the entire facade. Robert Hart. They heard it first with shock. Eyebrows shot up, eyes darted around, searching for someone else, someone they recognized. The banquet hall, moments ago alive with clinking crystal and rehearsed toasts, fell into an eerie stillness. A single chandelier bulb winked, as if uncertain whether to keep shining on the polished silverware below. Then they heard it again. Robert Hart. This time without inflection, flat, deliberate, undeniable. It vibrated through the rows of linen-draped tables, rolled over the stage, seeped into every gilded corner. Time slowed. Waiters stopped, mid-stride. A distant speaker's hum cut off as though someone had snapped the wire. Only that name remained. The man they'd banished to the margins, now the center of their world. All around me, people shifted in their seats, yanked at collars, smoothed hair, faces formerly alight with self-assurance drained of color. The same hands that had poured wine now trembled, dropping a glass that tinkled on the floor with a final accusatory ring. Chairs scraped back as guests rose, bodies leaning forward, necks craning. Their eyes, once glazed in polite performance, now searched mine, desperation mingled with regret. They had built their gala on borrowed time, on borrowed funds, on borrowed dignity, never knowing that each step was supported by the very man they erased. And in that stifling silence they were forced to see him, not as the guy from trade school, not as a name on a missed invite, but as the architect of their night, the silent sponsor whose legacy they had tried to rewrite. I sat motionless, heart steady, chest light. There was no bitterness in my gaze, only profound clarity. The room may have stopped, but I had already begun to move forward, guided by something far stronger than their belated recognition. In that cavern of hush, I glimpsed the truth I'd always known, that honoring a name means more than uttering it. It means holding its meaning, a lifetime of work, of quiet sacrifice, of steadfast integrity, above every glittering surface. And as the final echoes of my name faded, I realized they had finally learned that legacy isn't a guest list item. It's the foundation beneath every floor, the pulse behind every celebration, the voice that will never truly be silenced. I stood slowly. No one called me up. No spotlight shifted. No music swelled. Just the quiet creak of a chair folding back into its own silence, and the sound of my daughter rising with me, her hand briefly brushing mine before letting go. Not to step away, but to let me step forward. I began to walk, through the same room where I'd been invisible just hours before, through clusters of people who now stared, wide-eyed, unsure whether to smile or look away. I didn't walk fast. I didn't smile. I didn't wave. I just moved with the weight of every year they'd overlooked, every name they'd remembered instead of mine, every glance they had chosen not to give. Some nodded half-heartedly, some stood. Most didn't know what to do with their hands. The same hands I once shook with calloused fingers after helping fix a leaky roof, or carrying their mother's groceries, or cutting a check for their fundraiser anonymously when they couldn't meet their goal. Those hands now fidgeted with silverware, champagne stems, folded napkins, anything to escape the confrontation of conscience. And me? I didn't feel anger. It had burned away years ago, in the silence of late nights working without thanks. In the back seat of carpools they forgot to say thank you for. In the schools I helped repair and the scholarships I funded under a foundation name they never looked up. And I didn't feel pride either, not the kind they bathed in. What I felt was something quieter. Dignity, the kind that doesn't shout, doesn't demand, doesn't rise to be seen, but simply because it knows it has earned the right to stand. I passed the table where Dana sat, her posture perfect, but her face fractured in something more honest than any makeup could conceal. Her eyes met mine, and for a second I saw her trying to say something. Maybe I'm sorry. Maybe I didn't know. Maybe nothing at all. I nodded once. That was enough. Mark shifted awkwardly in his seat, as if suddenly unsure of his own status in a room where the ground had just changed. The host at the podium cleared his throat, unsure if I was actually coming forward, unsure what to do with a man who didn't ask to be honored, but now stood before the crowd like the very foundation beneath their feet. I stopped at the foot of the stage, didn't climb it. Didn't need to. I looked around, not at the chandeliers, not at the tablecloths or polished glass, but at the people. Not one of them had changed clothes. But the room had changed, because sometimes truth doesn't need to be announced. It just needs to stand up and walk. And I had walked through every person who once forgot me, not as proof that I belonged, but as proof that I never needed permission to. I didn't take the stage, not right away. I stood at the base of it, beneath the glow of a light that wasn't aimed for me, and waited. Not for applause. There was some, scattered and awkward, like people clapping more for the silence than for the man now breaking it. Not for a welcome. None came. I waited because I wanted them to feel it, the discomfort, the recognition, the slow, unraveling truth that the man they had looked through was the one who had made it all possible. The host gestured awkwardly toward the steps, unsure what protocol demanded in a moment like this. I gave him a small nod, climbed 2 steps, and stopped at the podium. Not towering over them, but level enough to look them in the eyes. I didn't bring a speech, didn't need one. I had lived it. The microphone squeaked softly as I adjusted it. The room was silent, holding its breath, and I looked only at her, my daughter, sitting alone at the back table, where the light didn't reach, still calm, still proud, her hands folded gently in her lap like her mother used to do when she knew something important was about to be said. And I found her face in the crowd and let her be my anchor. Then I spoke. "Sometimes," I said, voice even, quiet but clear enough to stretch across the glitter and glasses, "you build something so quietly, they don't hear you until they're standing on it." A pause. You could feel it, a shift like glass under pressure. I could have ended there. It might have been enough. But I kept going. Not for them. For her. I wasn't invited to this night. Not because there wasn't room, but because there wasn't recognition. And that's fine. I didn't build my life to be seen. I built it so others could stand on it. And they have. You have. I looked out at faces I once knew, now pale, stilled, fractured. There's a difference between being important and being essential. Some of us learned how to be the beam, not the banner. Some of us gave quietly, paid anonymously, showed up when no one clapped. I saw one of the older teachers lower her eyes. I saw a younger man swallow hard. And still I stood. Legacy isn't written on banners. It's written in silence. In the nights no one saw you working. In the checks no one saw you write. In the hands that held others up long before they learned how to applaud. I turned back toward my daughter again. She hadn't blinked. Eliza used to say, "Build like you'll never get credit, and then one day you won't need it." She was right. I didn't need your thanks. I didn't need your tables. I didn't even need your stage. I looked once more across the room of mirrors and saw the cracks. Cracks where pride used to live. Cracks that let light in. I only needed one thing. I pointed gently back to the far corner. My daughter, to see that it's possible to be forgotten by a room and still have built it. Silence again, but not empty this time. Full, wide, final. I stepped down, walked back toward her. She stood before I reached her, her arms around me before I could even sit. And in that quiet, broken room, I felt something no applause could ever give. Peace. Because the real legacy isn't being remembered by everyone. It's being remembered rightly by the one who matters most.